Chapter 5 of Flowers from the Garden of St. Francis for every day of the year. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Month of May. First Day. St. Francis said, "Idleness is the hotbed of evil thoughts." We must then give ourselves earnestly to some serious occupation. Second Day. St. Francis said, "If sacred things do not receive the veneration which is due to them, but if on the contrary they are neglected or left lying about, we ought to collect them and put them in a fitting place, honouring thus in the Word the Lord who pronounced it." Third Day. St. Francis said, "Blessed the one who does not speak through hope of reward, who is not always ready to unburden himself of his secrets, who is not anxious to speak, but who reflects prudently on what he is to say and the manner in which he is to reply." Fourth Day. St. Francis said, "It seems to me difficult and embarrassing to be possessed of worldly goods, which we can only preserve at the price of 1,000 annoyances, often even being obliged to have recourse to arms to put a stop to the quarrels and lawsuits which arise therefrom." Fifth Day. St. Francis said, "Happy that servant of God who is not troubled or put out by anything in the world, and who leads a holy and detached life." Sixth Day. St. Bonaventure said, "The sovereign virtue of man is humility. It is that which cures, perfects, and keeps him. Without humility we can acquire no other virtue, nor attain to perfection." Seventh Day. St. Francis said, "It is ridiculous to pride oneself on the favour of men or the things of the earth. What is great before men is an abomination before God." Eighth Day. St. Francis said, "It is easy to recognize if a servant of God have the spirit of his Divine Master when God makes use of him to perform some good work. On such occasion he does not give way to self-complacency, which is always contrary to true virtue, but on the contrary he is disposed to see himself humbled, and considers himself in all things inferior to others." Ninth Day. St. Clare said, "Never forget that the way which leads to heaven is narrow, that the gate leading to life is narrow and low, that there are but few who find it and enter by it, and if there be some who go in and tread the narrow path for some time, there are but very few who persevere therein." Tenth Day. St. Francis said, "Consider and see how the day of death approaches. With all respect, I beg of you not to forget God amid the many distracting occupations in which your life is spent, and do not wander from the way of His commandments." 11th Day. St. Anthony of Padua said, "When man follows the inspirations of grace, he finds liberty and peace. In this state we may say that fear renders him free, and that love enslaves him." 12th Day. St. Francis said, "The inestimable price of divine love suffices to gain heaven, and the love of Him who has so much loved us has many claims on our hearts." 13th Day. St. Bernardone of Siena said, "Justice constitutes true nobility of soul. It gives to each one his due rank. It maintains respect to superiors, harmony with equals, lenity with inferiors. It requires of us obedience to God, purity within ourselves, patience towards enemies, and compassion for the unfortunate." 14th Day. Saint Joseph of Cupertino said, "Every good work ought to be done with the view of obtaining the mercy of God for our own sins and those of others." 15th Day, Saint Elzéar said, "It ought to be a cause of confusion to us, that being placed on this earth in order to fit ourselves for heaven, we yet think so little of our home, and speak of it so rarely." 16th Day, Saint Francis said, "Those wants which do not come from reason, but from mere sensuality, are manifest signs of the loss of fervour. When the heart begins to grow tepid and draws away from grace, flesh and blood always seek to satisfy themselves." 17th Day, Saint Francis said, "Know that there are many high and sublime things in the eyes of God which are vile and abject in the esteem of men, while on the contrary there are numberless things which men consider grand and beautiful, and which are mean and valueless before God." 18th Day, Saint Francis said, "O you who imagine you still have a long time before you to enjoy the vanities of the world, how strangely you deceive yourselves. There cometh a day and an hour of which you will not think, and which you do not know." 19th Day, Saint Francis said, "Happy the one who is not less humble among his inferiors than before his masters and superiors." 20th Day, Saint Francis said, "The malice of the detractor is far greater than that of the thief, because the law of Christ, which is fulfilled by showing mercy, commands us to desire more ardently the salvation of the soul than the safety of the body." 21st Day, Saint Francis said, "Man, not having many souls, but only one, ought to take so much the more care of it." 22nd Day, Blessed Egidius said, "I consider it no less a virtue to know how to keep silence at the proper time than to speak well. It seems to me that man ought to have a neck as long as a crane's, so that each of his words may pass through many knots before leaving his mouth." 23rd Day, Saint Catherine of Bologna said, "How blind men are to make so little account of time, having one day to render account of how uselessly they employed it. This time, which, however short, may merit an eternity, but which, once passed, can never be regained." 24th Day, Blessed Egidius said, "Man ought to take great care to keep the grace which comes from God, and to work faithfully with it, because we too often sacrifice the fruit for the leaves, the grain for the straw." 25th Day, Saint Francis said, "When an inferior commits a fault, the superior ought not to get into a passion, but correct, warn, and bear with him in all patience and humility." 26th Day, Saint Francis said, "We have no right to glory in ourselves on account of any marvellous gifts, because these do not belong to us, but to God. But we may glory in crosses, afflictions, and tribulations, because these are our own." 27th Day, Saint Francis said, "We are so much the wiser by how much better we observe what we know, because it is by the fruit we recognize the tree." 28th Day, Saint Francis said, "Blessed are those who suffer patiently from others blame, reproach, and contradiction." 29th Day, Saint Bonaventure said, "We cannot help all who suffer, but we can at least have compassion on all, and see Jesus Christ in all." 30th Day, St. Francis said, "Happy he who receives reproaches with gentleness, listens respectfully to all that is said to him, confesses his fault humbly, and hastens to make satisfaction for it." 31st Day, St. Francis said, "It is only through the poor we can offer anything to God, who also has need of the poor in order to ask anything of us." End of chapter 5.